Hello, everybody. Great to see you. Just waiting for the last couple of people to join us from the waiting room. Thanks for your patience. Thanks for bearing with us. We're a nice big group tonight. Okay, it's the last person joining us now, so we might get started. Good evening. As I said, thank you so much for joining us tonight. I'd like to begin this evening by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which I'm currently seated, the Yagara and Turrbal people. I pay my respects to their elders past and present and acknowledge that this always was and always will be Aboriginal land. It is my pleasure to be here with you all this evening for this discussion of Barry Jones's What is to be Done. Before I hand you over to this evening's speakers, I'd just like to really quickly reiterate some of the information that you were sent in the email with your link to join us tonight. So you've all automatically been placed on mute, but that doesn't mean that Barry isn't interested in answering your questions, because he is. It might just look a little bit different to other events that you've attended. So at Avid Reader, we take questions via the chat box. It is towards the lower left of your screen. You can click on the icon there. If you can't see it right now or you can't find it, don't worry about it too much. I'm going to be posting the link that you can use to purchase copies of Barry's book through us at Avid Reader there shortly. And when I do so, it will pop up. In that box, type your questions. They will come straight through to me, and then I will read them out for Barry to answer later on in the evening when we head to the Q&A session. And so it is now my pleasure to introduce Barry Jones. Barry was a Labour member of the Victorian and Commonwealth Parliaments, led the campaign to abolish the death penalty, and became Australia's longest serving Minister for Science from 1983 to 1990. His books include Sleeper's Wake, A Thinking Read, Dictionary of World Biography, and The Shock of Recognition. He received a Companion of the Order of Australia, Australia's highest award, in 2014, and at the age of 87 is a living national treasure. In conversation with Barry tonight, we have with us Dr. Mike Richards. Mike is a political scientist, former newspaper editor, and chief of staff or consultant to several Labour leaders in Australia and New Zealand. And so, Barry and Mike, it is now my pleasure to hand over to you both for tonight's discussion.
Well, thank you, Emma, and good evening, everybody. It's great to be seeing you, if we can't necessarily at this point hear you. And Barry, welcome. We thought we might start off, everybody, by talking a little bit about the US election, given that it's top of mind and we've all been glued, at least Barry and I have been glued to our TVs and phones to try and understand what's going on in the final few states of Pennsylvania and Arizona, Nevada and Georgia. I think that's what it's come down to at this point. So Barry, what's your, and particularly Trump, because you've got a chapter in the book on the Trump phenomenon, and can we start off by having you give your current assessment of where the election is and what it means that 60 million people have supported Donald Trump?
Well, the election has been an extraordinary one because the assumption was, first of all, when Trump was elected in 2016, it was a classic illustration of the outsider against the insider. That a lot of people who supported Trump because he had no political experience. Normally, you know, in our system, if somebody had no political experience, we'd regard that as a bit of a negative. But over there are enough people who said, we don't trust politicians, we don't trust the political process. And the result is, if somebody says, I'm a businessman, I'm a deal maker, I'm a fixer, then that was enough to get a support, which strategically, it meant that with the Electoral College being what it is, it was possible for Trump to get up even though he was about almost 3 million votes behind Hillary Clinton. What's now happened is that it's clear that it was not simply an aberration in 2016. In fact, there are a very large number of people who have no faith at all in what we take as being the central elements of the American political system. In other words, respect for minorities, the idea of trying to bring some degree of unity, of making decisions that are based on some kind of rational process of analysis. And in fact, I think what Trump has succeeded in doing is confirming something that it's a theme, incidentally, running through the book. That is, the most important thing often in politics is getting a narrative and getting the narrative right. It doesn't matter whether it's true or not. It may be a fairy story, but if a lot of people identify with that fairy story, and they think of a world in which there are demons, there are enemies, they have to be fought, there are heroes, and so on. It all sounds a bit like a romantic story. But if I could just read for a minute a paragraph which I think is absolutely relevant. This is written, some months ago. I said, Trump is a fabulist whose narrative encouraged a large cohort of Americans, but was mysterious or infuriating to everybody else. But Trump was not talking to Europeans or Australians. Why bother about the rest of the world? They don't vote in American elections, although in reality, they become non-voting constituents. In contemporary society, developing a narrative has greater psychological carrying power than relaying the facts provided by experts. Subjective factors outweigh objective ones. It seemed to me that what troubled me about the election campaign was that Trump's energy filled the screen. You couldn't take your eyes off him. Whereas Biden, who you might regard as the more virtuous of the two candidates, did look really quite fragile. And that energy came across. And of course, now it's coming out in Steve Bannon, who was very closely associated with Trump. And your participants here may not have caught up, but this most recent statement of his, where he said, what they ought to be doing is to behead Anthony Fauci, the great epidemiologist on COVID, and to behead Chris Wray, the head of the FBI, put their heads on a pike and put them at the edge of the White House and say, that's what happens to people who don't follow the line. Now, this is not just normal politics. This is horrific. But it's clear that because of the policy of division, of saying that the way to win an election is to think of the community as being like a great big pie. And if you get your knife and carve the pie up so that you've got a 60% share of that pie, and you concentrate on that, doesn't matter what happens to the 40%, the 60% will guarantee your success. And I thought the way that with Trump, with this emphasis on being the outsider, I thought the most telling blow that Trump laid on Biden was to say, I've done more as 47 months as President of the United States than you did in 47 years as a senator and as vice president, because he's a classic insider's insider. And but you've now got a society where families are divided, where people are not talking to each other because the political, social, cultural divide is so profound.
You've made the point too that there is a contra example on the progressive side of Jacinda Ardern, who similarly has a very different narrative, but the appeal is that she does have a narrative. Could you elaborate on that a little bit? I thought that was a compelling point.
But her narrative is a narrative about inclusion, and it's a narrative about empathy. She is quite phenomenal. You know her, but I've not met her, but you know her quite well. And when you reflect about the role that Jacinda Ardern played in with the volcanic explosion at White Island, the way in which she brought people together, the way in which she expressed the national concern about the victims and the terrible things that happened to them when the volcano blew up. Her treatment of what happened when she went to Christchurch after the terrible massacre by the Australian white supremacists, that was simply exemplary. You couldn't have imagined it being done better. Her handling of COVID was excellent. She got the right kind of advice. She acted, but she explained. And in a way, you'd have to say with Anastasia Palaszczuk, she was very successful, I think, as the recent election result indicated, that she had a clear narrative. And her narrative was to say, look, this may not be popular. I know it's an interference with people's lives, but my primary concern is the protection of people, particularly older people. And if we can act in order to protect those older people by shutting the water, very inconvenient for business and so on, but nevertheless, we've got to do it. And it was, you mightn't have agreed with everything that she did, but it was a rational and a compassionate and an empathic approach. So that it depends on what you've got. But now, Bannon is actually saying it's now time to declare total war. Eric Trump, the president's son, said now's the time for total war. In other words, they're not going to take any prisoners. This is a war game.
Yeah. So looking at the likely result, Biden narrowly, he only needs to put Nevada and Arizona together, and he's got his 270 in the Electoral College, which appears to be the pathway for him.
And I think you probably also get Pennsylvania as well. The gap is very narrow now.
Yeah. What do you think will be the outcome in terms of the prospect of civil unrest? Will Trump accept the result? What will happen to him when he has to vacate the White House, do you imagine?
Well, it'll be a very ugly scene. I think the probability is that the Supreme Court won't intervene. They intervened, of course, famously in the year 2000. You had a situation there with Florida where the case for stopping the count was very strongly promoted by the governor of Florida and by the Secretary of State of Florida. Whereas in the case of, say, Pennsylvania, you've got the governor and the Secretary of State of Pennsylvania very much in favor of keeping the vote going until it's concluded. And the whole business of the hanging chads in Florida in 2000 meant that there were serious discrepancies, serious problems about what counting the votes actually meant. So I'm not defending what the Supreme Court did, but I can understand a rational basis for it. Yeah. I think it's very unlikely, even with the numbers on the Supreme Court, that they will intervene. I think, too, the problem that Biden has is if you take an issue like climate change, which of course, again, is one of the absolutely central issues in my book, Biden will indicate his desire to adhere to the Paris Accords, but the question is whether he'll have the numbers in the Senate to actually ratify the Paris Accords treaty. Now, the point is, with Trump gone, and it may be that there'll be a number of people who are in the Republican camp, like Susan Collins, or indeed Mitt Romney, who might be persuaded to join with the Democrats because they have no great enthusiasm for Trump. And they may see it as a repudiation of Trumpism. I think it's going to be extremely difficult for Biden to bring about the kind of changes that he would like to see in the American scene, if he can't get legislation through the Senate.
Yeah.
And
sorry, can we turn more directly to the book? I mean, there is a chapter, of course, on Trump and the Trump phenomenon, which is extremely interesting. One of the central tenets of the book is that democracy is in an existential crisis.
yeah,
There are issues, systemic issues that are affecting Western democracies, including ours. Can you elaborate on that proposition a little bit? Where you think these, because you've been, I mean, you contrast the federal parliament when you first arrived with the character of the MPs of which you were one, and the kind of people who are drawn into politics these days. Can you elaborate on that a little bit for us?
well, we'll start off with that. What I'm conscious of is that if you reflect, go back to the 1970s, where you had a comparatively small number of Australians finished degrees. And in fact, back in the Parliament of 1977, when I went in, there was not a single female member of the House of Representatives. The composition of the House of Representatives was overwhelmingly white Anglo males. There were a handful of people of Greek origin, but really nothing else. But what they did have in their favour was life experience. They'd gone into politics because they had a passion for something, because and I was struck with a number of my contemporaries, you know, who'd say who'd suffered an industrial injury. We had people with, you know, with one eye or missing a few fingers, or perhaps with a damaged leg, something like that. But when they spoke, they were prodigious readers. They had no formal education to speak of, but they were prodigious readers, and they were committed to something. Clyde Cameron, I often quote this. Clyde Cameron, you know, from South Australia, had left school at 14 or 15. He'd been a shearer, then he'd been a party official and so on. But he was a prodigious reader. And it meant if the word went round that Cameron was going to be speaking on a subject, the house would fill up because they wanted to hear what he had to say. It was always very interesting. If you warned people that our Deputy Prime Minister, Michael McCormick, was going to speak, there'd be a rush for the exit. Nobody would want to stand around to listen to it because they say, what on earth, all it would be to produce some dot points that he had, and he'd simply read them out. Too many of our current politicians have gone into it because they say politics is a career. And this is the era of retail politics, not of conviction politics. And I've often told the story, and I've got it in the book, that as a professorial fellow at Melbourne University, I've had so many people who come to me and say, look, I'm seriously interested in a career in politics. And I say, oh, really? How interesting. I say, which political party do you think? And they say, well, I haven't really thought about that. What would you advise? And I say, well, you know, what are your political views? Do you tend towards a highly individual view of things and with a heavy emphasis on the economy, or are you concerned with social issues, social justice? And they often will say, well, I haven't really worked that out. You know, do you think I should do that? And then if I say to them, what are the 3 issues that you feel most passionate about? They say, oh, do you think that's really necessary? And then, I should never have done this, but sometimes I say to them, I say, what's the issue that you'd be prepared to go to jail over? And then they say, well, they say, well, look, maybe I'd be better off as an accountant. And so so the result is that, and typically within the political system, they join a faction because they know they've got no hope of preferment if they're not in a faction, and they work their way up. First of all, they go and make the coffee, and then they get the sandwiches, and then they proceed up the ladder. And then the time is that they serve the faction faithfully, that somebody will say, your time has come. And away they go. So the result was that the Parliament, two things that I've written about extensively in the book that people don't quite grasp, I think, is that, first of all, Australia holds the gold medal for the short number of days that the Parliament sits. It's extraordinary to reflect that over a very long period, and of course 2020 will have even lower figures, it'll bring the average down, but you had a typical sitting year is around 67 days of the year the Parliament sits. In Great Britain, in the United States, in Japan, in Canada, it's around 150. So we take for granted that the Parliaments don't sit very much, that the Parliaments really are like a kind of an electoral college. And the electoral college really chooses the executive, just as the electoral college does in the United States. And then, once the executive is installed, executives really regard parliamentary sittings as a bit of a nuisance. And they'd rather do without it. They just simply go on and do their mysterious, carry on their mysterious work with themselves, and they don't want too much exposure to what they're doing. So it's just an embarrassment for them to have Parliament sitting. And the ultimate horror of things like Senate, expenditure committee, they'll raise issues that people are embarrassed by. That's why we've got virtually no chance under this government anyway of having anything like a National Integrity Commission that has any teeth. In other words, it could be used as an instrument to protect your friends and punish enemies.
Yeah. I can briefly tell a story. When I was working on John Cain's staff, the Labor Premier of Victoria, from 1982 until 1990. Neville Wran was the Labor Premier of New South Wales, and he came down to visit John Cain, and they had a discussion that I was present at in his office. And Neville Wran said, John, the only bit of advice I've got for you is don't take Parliament too seriously. It's a distraction. Well,
yeah. I can understand that.
Reinforces your point and says it all. Can we move more broadly to this question of why there is such dysfunction, as you describe it in the book, and a shared dysfunction between the major parties, the coalition on the one hand and Labor on the other? That they have a shared sense of career purposes for themselves. They seek to wedge one another for a political advantage, but it's all about the careers of the MPs and not at all about making a difference, addressing the major issues that the nation faces and so on. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Well, I mean, related to that is the sense that the preoccupation is always with the very short term. The preoccupation with winning the next election. And I can be pretty confident. In fact, I've challenged a couple of people I know in the government, and they've agreed with my proposition that after the coalition unexpectedly won the 2019 federal election, you could be absolutely certain that the first item on the agenda when the cabinet met would be, how do we win again in 2022? And the question was, we've got to hold together the alliances that we have. We've got to have the same political support. We've got to have the same media support that we did before. We can't allow any kind of interest group, by which you really mean vested interests, to be upset and to withdraw their power. You can see, for example, that I identified 4 significant Australians who have a political influence, or certainly had a political influence, that is completely out of proportion to their numbers, because there's only 4 of them. If you take Gina Rinehart, I think it'd be fair to say that the the National Party is a wholly owned subsidiary of Gina Reinhardt, and that when Michael McCormick was challenged by Waleed Ali about if he could remember a case where there'd been a dispute within the party between the farmers and miners, which had been resolved in favour of the farmers, and he had to admit he couldn't think of an example. Then you've got Twiggy Forrest over in Western Australia exercising an enormous influence. Rupert Murdoch, tremendous amount of influence, and in Queensland, for example, it's very difficult to identify any kind of paper, even a regional paper, which is not part of News Corp. So if you've only got the choice, say, between Murdoch and Murdoch, that's a pretty limited kind of range. And then Clive Palmer, who spent $83 million in the 2019 election, and certainly largely achieved what he wanted, which was simply to keep Labor out. Although I must say, your audience will be better informed with me on this. What I found absolutely mysterious is why Palmer's tactics didn't work in the state election. I don't know how many millions he ultimately spent in the end, but I think the accusation about the death tax that Labor was supposed to be about to introduce, I think that was seen as so completely over the top that it was counterproductive, and that says a lot for Queenslanders that they saw through all that. But there's no doubt his influence, although he got knocked back in the High Court in his action against the West Australian government, but he's been a political phenomenon, and it may be that, like Pauline Hanson, his rocket is about to come back to Earth, but he's certainly exercised an enormous influence, and he's the sort of person that you don't want to get into a row with. And this is why you find that there's short-term issues, whereas if you go back, say, and I'm sorry to look back to the 70s as kind of a golden age, but when you think of the number of people who really were looking at those very long-term issues, like, for example, the ending of white Australia, like the recognition of dealing with the People's Republic of China, like transforming the whole nature of the economic base, getting away from our dependence on tariffs, for example. These were not things that happened overnight. And people were prepared to argue and argue and argue. And you also had a collection of people like who were certainly not populist. I mean, if you take, say, what did Gough Whitlam, Bob Carr, Don Dunstan, Paul Keating have in common? Well, what they had in common was you wouldn't get them going to a football match except at gunpoint, and that the interests that they had, that was interested in Greco-Roman ruins, Bob Carr was interested in Marcus Aurelius and American presidents of the 19th century. Don Dunstan was interested in chamber music. But the point was, you might say these are not popular issues, but they were seen as authentic. They were seen as authentic. That what we regard as an eccentricity, well, it wasn't because they said, oh, look, a focus group said, look, we think it'd be a good idea if you indicated that you haven't got any interest in sport, but you are very interested in listening to Wagner's operas. Nobody in focus groups go to say that. But people recognise that they were the real thing.
Can we turn to one of the if not the central core of your new book, climate change, and how you account for the persistent failure of the major parties to ignore and downplay and have Labor has got a contradictory policy in relation to coal mining in particular. What's your current assessment of the prospects of any significant change as we go forward, with America having only earlier this week withdrawn from the global treaty? Where does the science stand in relation to the interconnection with politics and the commitment by political parties to address it?
Well, you've got, it varies from country to country. It's extraordinary to think, say, that Boris Johnson's position on climate change is to the left of the Labour Party's position in Australia, for example, on climate change. And you can see that the other European leaders, Macron and Angela Merkel, who of course will be going fairly soon, are really very, very strong on the issue. If you think of the number, the European governments agreed that there was a climate emergency. New Zealand agreed that there's a climate emergency. Canada has legislated to recognise a climate emergency. There's no possibility of the Australian Parliament saying there's a climate emergency, although there's a very strong case for arguing that Australia has actually already reached the 1.5 degree increase in global, in mean temperature continentally. And this country of all countries is the one that's most likely to be adversely affected. But the point is that you've got powerful interest groups who say, look, we've got to maintain our traditional economic base. And our traditional economic base is that essentially, although we're one of the most urbanized countries on earth, we're essentially a farm and a quarry, not much else. That's where we're going. And one of the things that really struck me is that one would have thought that the digital revolution, which of course is part of one of the essential parts of the book, the digital revolution gives us access to an extraordinary plenitude of material. You can have the most wonderful data at your fingertips. But on the other hand, if your view of the world is simply mediated by gazing at a screen all the time, then you've always got that delete button at hand. And if you come across something that you don't want to hear, or something that doesn't suit you, or something you don't feel comfortable about, you say, well, look, that's just somebody else's opinion. And the tragedy of the digital revolution, and something I got wrong in Sleepers Wake. I mean, Sleepers Wake had a pretty good hit score, I would think. But one of the things that I did get wrong was that the assumption was that as the level of formal qualification in the electorate increased, and we've now got 6.9 million graduates in Australia, and at our peak, we used to have about 1.3 million people undergoing education at universities at the moment. Of course, the university is now somewhat stricken by what's happened with COVID. But that would have thought that you'd have an extraordinarily well-developed group of people who were right on top of the issue. Well, not at all. What's happened with the digital revolution is that to a very large extent, people say, look, all these things are really matters of opinion. Don't worry about the evidence. It's the way we feel. The way we feel about things is the critical thing. And if you're not comfortable with evidence that doesn't suit your interests, well, you simply disregard it. You simply ignore it. I came across a wonderful couple of sentences which I can't help sharing with you, that written by the American writer Bill McKibben, where he said, when you spent the past generation staring into a screen where everything is editable and manipulable, it would become difficult to take reality very seriously. But the physical world is not a backdrop. We can try to wish away physics and chemistry, is what the climate deniers have been doing for years. We can try and wish away biology. Donald Trump has attempted to do both, but science isn't interested. In other words, you can, if you say, well, look, the evidence is there, but really it doesn't suit me. And the tragedy, I think, for our political system, and this is one of the things, I suppose the rallying cry in the late part of the book, is that, in fact, if you thought of the number of people in the community who have absolutely expert knowledge from direct observation in their lives, if you take farmers, if you take gardeners, if you take bushwalkers, if you take whale watchers, if you take a whole collection of aviators, not quite apart from people who are involved in the sciences around university, that expertise is there, but it isn't harnessed. It isn't harnessed. And what drives me mad about my own party, which I've been in for far too long, I'd have to say, but my own party is that in a way, they've ducked really talking about the science because they say, oh, it's too complicated, people won't follow it. Well, I think people are smarter than that, and you've got to engage with the science. You've got to engage with the central issue and say, look, every ton of coal, when burnt, produces 3.67 tons of CO2. And that stays around in the atmosphere for decades. It's possible it may even stay around for more than a century, but for a very long period anyway. And that's the central factor that is changing the nature of the relationship between the energy that comes in from the sun and that is retained as a kind of blanket, really, rather more than a greenhouse around the earth. And once you start to lose that sense of equilibrium, once you find that that CO2 is not being absorbed by forests because the forests have been cut down, or not being absorbed by seawater because the seawater has become the saline percentage has increased and it's less receptive to CO2, then we are in a very serious situation. And it may be that, as Bill McKibben says, that we might come to look at 2020, the COVID year, as being a kind of a dry run for what we might expect for the rest of the decade. Well, no, I'm sorry, for the rest of the century.
Yeah.
But the point is, you'd have to say that we've come to accept the view that we can only deal with one crisis at a time. Once it was the bushfires, and that was badly handled. Then came COVID, which was actually quite well handled. And you might have thought that was an indication that we'd be going in a fresh direction, but not at all.
Yeah.
We followed science where it came to COVID. We don't follow the science where it comes to climate change. And one of the most disturbing things, and I draw attention to it in the book, in the very last chapter, there's a thing called the economic complexity index. What's happened is that the valuable exports in the world now are not fossil fuels. The valuable exports in the world are products which have a considerable intellectual input. I mean, vaccines are a classic example. And Australia is going in absolutely the wrong direction. Harvard University have produced this Atlas of Economic Complexity, and I'll just say this very quickly and just get it out of the way. With the ECI rankings, in 1995, Australia ranked number 55. Not a very good figure, but 55 in 1995. By 2018, we'd gone to 87. You see, whereas a country like South Korea had gone from 21 to 3. Singapore had gone from 20 to 5. And we're saying, in effect, look, those countries, they can do all the clever stuff, but we're going to go up for high volume, low added value exports simply because we've got such a lot of them. Now, what the problem is, it will often mean going to people and saying to people in particular communities, there are 37,000 coal miners, and those 37,000 coal miners can't be ignored. But it's a matter of talking to them directly and being honest with them and saying, what do you want your children and your grandchildren to be doing?
Yeah.
Do you want them to be moving in a fresh direction where there are all sorts of new jobs developing, or do you want to simply say, we'll continue on a path where there will be decreased international demand for products? That's going into a dead end.
Yeah. Before we open it up for questions, can I just get you in a very short summary to offer the essence of the title of the book? What is to be done? What is your prescription for how we might shift direction?
Well, in the last chapter, I talk about the way in which we can transform the Australian economy and how we could become, in effect, an economic superpower in the post-carbon era. If we move away from oil and gas and say, we have the potential in Australia to be a world leader and to be a world exporter in a whole number of areas. And I've followed very closely the kind of work that Ross Garnaut has been doing. And I can't go into it in enough detail, but I've dealt with it. It's probably the largest central part of the book, and the book that I'm, I suppose, the most excited about. The really important thing, though, is to raise the level of engagement from our informed Australian community. I don't mean just because of formal qualifications. I mean people who've thought about issues and really want to make a difference. At the moment, we've got 15 million voters in Australia. And of those 15 million voters, if you take the number of people who are actively involved in political parties, it's hard to be certain of the number, but I've made a careful calculation. I doubt if there are as many even as 30,000 people who are actively involved in political parties. And yet people go along and vote, compulsory voting, public funding of election campaigns, both of which I agree with, but it has the effect of armor plating political parties who then become closed oligarchies. And in a sense, the two political systems, you know, the Liberal Party has become the essentially the self-interest party. The National Party has become the coal party. The Labor Party has become the tepid party. The Greens have become the pure party because they've never any sense of how the kind of problems you've got to make in, say, putting together a comprehensive budget. And you've got a couple of candidates for the Me Party. But the point is that you've got these 15, you've got 0.2% of the population are actively involved in politics. And it drives me mad to hear of so many Australians, well-qualified, thoughtful Australians, who say, oh, there's 30,000 of them and there's only 15 million of us. But the 30,000 run the show. We can't do anything about it. Yeah. So it's got to be a matter of engagement, and to recognise, though, that if you're going to engage, it's going to cost you. It's going to cost you money. It probably cost you friends. It might cause a bit of embarrassment within the family. But if you want to change things seriously for not just the immediate future, but for the longer term, if you really want to guarantee to make sure that Australia makes the maximum contribution it can to be helping to shape world outcomes, which we're capable of doing if we form alliances with other middle-ranking powers like our own. But you've got to engage, and that engagement comes at a cost, and you've got to be prepared to do it.
Thank you. I'll hand back to Emma Kate at the moment to moderate the questions.
Thank you. Thanks, Mike. And thanks, Barry. This has been such a great discussion. We've had lots of questions. Thank you all for sending them through. We've got about 10 minutes, so I'll try and get through as many as I can. But they are all quite in-depth questions. So the first we have is from Hugo, who asks, what are your thoughts, Barry, on Kevin Rudd's media reform petition? And do you think it will get us anywhere?
I'm sorry, the which position?
On Kevin Rudd's media reform petition.
I think it is. I think it is tremendously important. But again, you find that no political leaders in office at the moment are prepared to run the risk of being of seriously offending Murdoch. So that I agree with what Kevin is saying. I can understand, that there's some fracturing within the Murdoch family itself over the way in which they handle certain issues. I think, that if, as looks likely, President Trump is forced out of office in the United States, then the Murdoch empire will have to think very seriously about, the role it's played in promoting and engaging people and converting them to Trumpism. And so I'm sympathetic, very sympathetic to what Kevin's trying to do.
Thank you. And we have another question from Vicky, who said that you mentioned earlier that the motivation to go into politics has moved from a passion for change to careerism. And she asks, why has that happened?
I think because they recognize that the parties are now closed bodies, closed organizations, and that you really only get the chance to move in, to get a pre-selection if you have a patron of some sort, or if you're affiliated with a faction. And I recognize now that if I look back at my own career, I'd have had no possibility of getting pre-selection for a seat, a safe seat, let alone a marginal seat, if I didn't join a faction and say, I swear that I'll put the faction first, and I wouldn't be prepared to do that. And then I've been struck by the number of my colleagues. I say to people like, Gareth Evans, or like Neil Blewett, or like Michael Duffy, and say, do you think under the present circumstances you could gain pre-selection for a winnable seat? And they all say no.
We have a comment from Angela and a question from David, and they tie in nicely together. So I'll read Angela's comment. She said that there was an interesting comment from David Littleproud about COVID and following the science. He has been pleading with the premiers to listen to the science in terms of opening up the borders, but refuses to listen to science when it comes to climate, environmental issues. And David has asked, how do we engage everybody in science education? He says it's essential from kindergarten to third age, and how do we engage everybody in this?
There's no doubt about the sheer complexity of science, and it's difficult. And one of the things I was engaged in for some years was a project called Into Science, which was really about science mentoring. And often the sad thing sometimes has been that people feel that they find themselves as science teachers when they'd rather have been doing something else, that they'd rather perhaps have been working in a laboratory or working in some project, but in fact that they take it on as a fallback position. And yet they're dedicated, wonderful people, but the sheer complexity of science can be a turn-off, and you've got to get people, well, using that word narrative, which I used earlier on, to explain what a wonderful human challenge, what a wonderful intellectual challenge science is, to be able to understand about the world, to be able to understand complexity. But people often find that they don't know how to tackle complexity. And the result is that they look at a complex problem and they're looking for a simple solution, rather than saying that a complex problem will demand a complex solution. We've got to face up to that.
Thanks. Toby has asked, do you think that the bastardization of the term socialism as a concept frightens voters without fully understanding the system, that the capitalist system was basically socialized in 2008 and therefore has resulted in polarization?
Look, the whole question of political language, actually, that's one of the chapters in the book that I won't have time to talk about now. But the way in which you use language, they toss words around. In the United States, I was staggered how, with the very mild propositions that were being put by Biden were attacked as sort of red revolution. Socialism become a kind of a boo word, and I think one of the problems was that probably around the time that Tony Blair became the leader of the Labour Party in Britain, and indeed when Bill Clinton became the presidential nominee of the Democrats, in a way, you ceased to have a major debate about alternative views of handling the economy. That there was a tremendous degree of convergence, and the result is that we've now. I think it's now time that we redefine the whole nature of political debate about how, to what extent, for example, if you take if you take an issue like gambling, for example, you can see that no major political party will take a strong attitude against gambling because, first of all, it's seen as being a significant contribution to the economy. And while it may destroy a lot of people's lives, well, you know, you don't want to be part of a nanny state that's intervening. So the result is that the question is whether you look at immediate short-term individual advantage as against some kind of collective view. Well, I think it's most likely that people will, want to be somewhere in that immediate position. So the result is that when you say socialism originally, of course, meant actually taking over an organization and running it in the name of the government. I think now, if somebody were to say, well, would it be a good idea for Qantas to simply become a wholly owned government, a wholly owned government corporation? I don't see a great deal of sense in that because you'd have to spend a tremendous amount of the budget to pushing it along, and you can use that money in more effective ways. So the result is that we've got to do a lot of redefining.
Thank you. And the last question that we have for tonight is from Sarah, and she has asked, with the deterioration of trust in democratic institutions, is democracy doomed, or is there a path to a new type of democracy?
Well, there could be a variety of different democracies, but the main thing about democracy is that demos, the people, have to be directly involved. And the result is that if you had on a census return, perhaps it's a good idea for a question to say, are you an active or a passive citizen? And if the answer that comes out in the referendum, in the census is that 99.8% of the population say we're passive, and only 2% say we're active citizens, well, you've got to ask some serious questions about where we're going. The question is whether people are prepared to devote time, energy, physical resources, money, and so on, to try and bring about a better society. It's not an easy job. Oscar Wilde once famously said the problem with socialism is it takes up too much time in the evenings. And if you're going to devote yourself to a cause, you've got to be prepared to devote that time to it. And people now will say, they say, well, look, I've got the football and I've got I've got all these other interests and I like to go down and play at the pokies and so on. I haven't got time for everything. It's a matter of determining priorities.
Thank you. I'm getting lots of thank you comments coming through the chat box as well. Thank you everybody for joining us this evening. Barry, thank you so much. Mike, thanks for your great questions. This has been a fantastic discussion. Do either of you have any last questions or comments that you would like to make before we conclude this evening?
Just encourage people to buy the book, and it makes a wonderful Christmas present. And even for non-Christians, but no, I think you've handled it very well, and I think it's been a very agreeable and at times almost joyous occasion, given the strange times that we're living in. Anyway, thank you very much for organising, and I think, as usual, my old friend Mike, who actually was a very influential role in the book, and he would look at sometimes what I'd written and said, no, comrade, you've got that wrong. You know, get back on the other track. And so he played a very important role with the book, I think.
Thank you so much. It's been an absolute pleasure to host. I'm getting lots of thank you messages from the chat, through the chat box, from everybody who's enjoyed the event. If you haven't seen, I've posted the link to purchase your copies of What Is to Be Done there. So follow that and you can pick them up through us at Avid Reader. Thanks again for joining us, Barry and Mike. It's been an absolute pleasure. Have a lovely rest of the evening, everybody.
Thank you, Emma, and thank you to all. Such good questions.
Terrific.
Thanks, everybody. Good night.
Good night.
Thanks, Barry. Bye.